For 2 days, you and your family have been without food. Finally, you see them. A small herd grazing within easy reach. Your muscles are ready. Your plan is laid out. Then it starts raining heavily. Not a quick shower. It rains on and on, hour after hour, all night. The animals disappear before you can move. Their footprints dissolve into mud. The ground becomes slippery and dangerous underfoot. Somewhere nearby, the river is rising, and the fire your group relies on to survive in the darkness, it's struggling to survive too. But today, the rain has a completely different meaning. You turn on the TV, popcorn, soda, and Netflix beside you. Or you might pull the blanket up to your feet. You check your phone to see if anyone's texted yet, and you'll drift off to sleep, because what could be better than the sound of rain falling on the window? But for your ancestors, that sound could be the difference between life and death, and not just in one way. Before this storm passed, it may have killed them from the cold, from the flood, or from something else waiting for them in the shadows. This wasn't just bad weather. This was a full-blown survival crisis, and figuring out how to overcome it may be one of the reasons you're still alive today. Before we delve deeper, if stories like this appeal to you, hit the subscribe button. There's more fascinating content to come. Let's break down exactly what that rain was doing to you. The first danger is cold, and it works faster than you'd think. Dry skin holds a thin layer of warm air close to your body. Water strips that layer away instantly. Heat doesn't just leave, it gets pulled out of you again and again every time a new drop lands. Stand in cold rain long enough, without shelter, without dry skin, and your body temperature starts dropping steadily. This is hypothermia, and it doesn't need a blizzard to happen. It just needs you wet, exposed, and out of options. For someone already weakened by 2 days without food, that drop could turn fatal far faster than it would for someone well-fed and rested. The second danger is water itself, moving. Many early shelters were tucked near rivers and streams, good for drinking, good for game passing through, but that same water source becomes a threat when the rain doesn't stop. Archaeologists have found flood layers inside caves that were later abandoned, bands of sediment washed in by rising water, sealing off spaces that once held fires, tools, footprints. Read that layer and you're reading a moment when a shelter stopped being safe. The third danger was already inside the cave with you. Caves weren't empty real estate. They were contested space, shared at different times with the same predators you were trying to avoid outside. At several sites, researchers have recovered human remains alongside puncture marks consistent with big cats. These are specific individual finds, not proof that every cave was a death trap, but they tell us something real. Shelter and danger sometimes lived under the same roof. A storm that pushed you deeper into a cave for warmth could also be pushing something else in from the other side. Put these three together and a pattern shows up. Rain didn't just delay the hunt. It attacked from every direction at once, pulling heat from your body, undercutting the ground beneath your shelter, and crowding you into close quarters with whatever else was seeking cover. None of these threats needed to be dramatic on their own. Combined, over hours, they were enough, which is exactly why what happened next wasn't optional. Before anything else, before tools, before food, before rest, there was one job that couldn't fail. That job was keeping the fire alive. Without it, there's no warmth to counter the cold soaking into your skin. No way to cook food, if you even find any. No real protection once night falls and everything else out there starts moving too. Fire wasn't a comfort, it was the one variable holding every other danger in check. Controlling fire goes back a long way. At Kesem Cave in Israel, evidence suggests people were managing fire in a sustained, repeated way around 400,000 years ago. Not just stumbling into it, but relying on it as part of daily life. Some researchers push this even earlier, pointing to burned material at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa dated to roughly 1 million years ago, though that claim is still debated, since fire-altered evidence that old is hard to separate from natural causes with certainty. Here's what's easy to miss. Keeping fire going and creating fire from nothing are two completely different skills. You can know how to nurse a flame for days without ever knowing how to strike one into existence. For most of human history, the safer bet was never letting the fire die in the first place. That meant carrying it, smoldering embers wrapped in leaves, or fungus that holds a spark for hours, known as tinder fungus. focus. Ötzi the Iceman, found preserved in the Alps and dated to around 5,300 years ago, was carrying exactly this kind of fire-starting kit when he died. Proof that this wasn't guesswork, it was standard equipment people carried on their bodies. Now put that skill under a downpour. Keeping fire alive in dry conditions is one challenge. Keeping it alive while rain works to drown it is another entirely. The response was practical. Push the fire deeper into the cave, away from the entrance where wind and water reach first. Choose fuel carefully. Dry wood buried under debris burns. Soaked wood doesn't. And birch bark became especially valuable here because it contains a compound that lets it catch and burn even when damp, something dead wood simply can't do. This is the part that's easy to underestimate. Someone had to sit there feeding a small flame hour after hour, making sure it never went out, while everyone else dealt with cold, hunger, and whatever else the storm brought in. That wasn't a side task. That was the job. One person's entire day spent protecting a fragile flame that everyone else's survival depended on. Fire secured, the group wasn't just surviving anymore. They had time, and that time had to go somewhere. That time became a workshop. Archaeologists digging through cave floors regularly find dense clusters of stone flakes and work tools, far more concentrated than you'd expect from someone just passing through. That kind of density points to people sitting in one place for extended stretches, actually making things. Idle hands with nowhere to go tend to produce exactly this pattern in the archaeological record. Blombos Cave in South Africa shows this clearly. Around 100,000 years ago, someone there was running what amounts to a small production line, grinding red ochre pigment, using shells as mixing containers, shaping bone tools to work the material. This wasn't a rushed, improvised task. It took time, planning, and a series of deliberate steps. Exactly the kind of work that fits into hours you'd otherwise spend waiting out a storm. Around 61,000 years ago, someone was doing something even more precise, shaping bone into needles fine enough to pierce hide. That kind of work needs steady hands, decent light, and long, uninterrupted focus. Conditions a cave sheltering from rain could actually provide. Then there's rope. At Abri du Marat in France, researchers recovered fragments of twisted plant fiber, cordage built from multiple strands wound together, a technique that requires understanding structure, not just tying knots. It's some of the oldest direct evidence of cord making ever found, and it's linked to Neanderthals, not modern humans, which says a lot about how far back this kind of thinking goes. In Germany, Hohlfels has produced a carved tool dated to around 35,000 years ago that appears purpose-built for twisting fiber into cord, essentially a dedicated piece of equipment for a single specific job. Why does rope matter this much? Because once you can make cord, you can bind a stone head to a shaft, build a trap, lash together a shelter frame. It's a small object that unlocks a much bigger toolkit. And it wasn't only tools. At Sibudu Cave in South Africa, people were building sleeping mats from reeds and sedge, layering in leaves from the Cape laurel tree, leaves that contain insect-repelling compounds. When a mat wore out or attracted pests, evidence suggests it was burned and rebuilt rather than simply reused. That means someone, roughly 77,000 years ago, was already managing pest control in their bedding, a level of forward planning that's easy to overlook. None of this happened because people were bored in the way you understand boredom. It happened because the rain had already taken away every other option, and what remained was time, attention, and the raw material sitting right there in the cave with them. But not everything made in that firelight was useful. Some of it wasn't practical at all. Rope, needles, sleeping mats, every one of those solved a real problem. What happened next didn't solve anything at all. Deep inside caves like Chauvet in France, dated to roughly 36,000 years ago, walls are covered in paintings of horses, lions, rhinos, rendered with a level of skill that still surprises researchers who study them. Lascaux and Altamira show similar work, and on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, figurative paintings have been dated to around 45,000 years old, currently the oldest known art of its kind anywhere on Earth. Here's the detail that matters. This art isn't sitting near cave entrances where you'd expect people to gather during a storm. At Chauvet, some of the paintings are located deep within the cave system, reached only after moving through narrow, low passages. passages, sections you'd have to crouch or crawl through, not casually wander into. Whoever made these wasn't sheltering from rain in the most convenient spot. They went out of their way into total darkness carrying a light source to work in places that weren't meant for everyday living. So why go that far for something with no survival value? This is where we have to be careful. Nobody can prove with direct evidence exactly why these paintings exist deep in these chambers, but the pattern is worth noticing. These are the same caves, the same time periods where people were already spending long stretches sheltering, tending fire, working material with their hands. If someone had the time to make rope and grind pigment during a stretch of bad weather, it's not a stretch to think that same block of time and that same firelight occasionally got spent on something with no practical output at all. Not proof, just a pattern that lines up. And that raises the real question underneath all of it. If people had reached a point where they could afford to spend hours on something that didn't feed them, didn't warm them, and didn't protect them from anything, what does that tell us about how far they'd already come? Because making art isn't what desperate survival looks like. It's what happens once survival stops taking up every single hour of your day. And it turns out tools and paintings weren't the only things being made in that firelight. Something else was being made too, and you couldn't hold it in your hands. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years recording conversations among the Juhoansi, a hunter-gatherer people in the Kalahari, and published her findings in 2014. What she found was a clear split. During daylight hours, conversation was almost entirely practical. Talk about food, tools, disputes, logistics. But once the sun went down and people gathered around the fire, that shifted dramatically. Well over 80% of nighttime conversation turned into something else entirely. Stories, songs, ritual, myth. That split matters because it suggests something specific about firelight itself. It wasn't just a source of heat and safety, it was a scheduled block of time every single day with nothing left to do but talk. And when people have nothing left to do but talk, they don't discuss logistics, they tell stories. Think about what that means functionally. A campfire wasn't just where people sat, it was where knowledge got passed from people who'd lived longer to people who hadn't yet. Which plants were safe, which animals were dangerous, what happened the last time a flood like this one hit. Long before anything was written down, the fire was doing the job libraries do now. And some of what got passed down held up remarkably well. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions include stories describing coastlines that no longer exist. Locations later confirmed by geologists to match sea levels from roughly 7,000 years ago. That's not folklore in the dismissive sense. That's a functioning information system, accurate enough to outlast the physical landscape it described, carried forward for thousands of years through nothing but repeated telling. Put this next to what a rainstorm actually does. It cancels the hunt. It cancels the day's usual work, but it doesn't cancel the fire, and it doesn't cancel the people sitting around it. If anything, it corners everyone into exactly the conditions Wiesner documented. Trapped together, work done, nothing left but each other and the flame. You still do a version of this. Different light source, different setting, but the impulse to gather around a glow and swap stories after the day's work is done didn't disappear. It just changed shape. So a flood stage storm wasn't only a threat to survive. It may have been one of the original conditions that let human culture take root, not despite being trapped, but because of it. Rain wasn't only take something away though, it gave something back too. Because once the storm passed, the ground itself told a different story. Dry, hard-packed earth barely holds a footprint. Soaked, softened ground does, clearly, deeply, exactly where an animal placed its weight. For anyone tracking prey, that's valuable information. A trail that would have been invisible 2 days earlier suddenly becomes readable, almost like it was left on purpose. Hunting couldn't happen during the storm itself, but right after, the landscape was, in a real sense, easier to read than before. Water mattered directly too. Natural hollows in rock and depressions in the ground caught rainfall, creating temporary reserves in places that might otherwise stay dry for stretches at a time. That's one less problem to solve, in an existence where finding clean water could otherwise eat up a huge part of the day. Rain also changed what was available to eat. Moisture triggers fungi to fruit, softens the ground enough to make roots and tubers easier to dig out, and draws insects to the surface in far greater numbers than during dry conditions. None of this required tools, planning, or risk. It just required showing up at the right moment, right after the rain let up. One example stands out. After heavy rain, termites often emerge in large numbers, swarming near the surface. That's a concentrated, easily gathered source of protein and fat. No chase, no weapon, no danger involved. This isn't only something inferred from the archaeological record. Chimpanzees today are observed doing exactly this, feeding heavily on termites that surface after rainfall. Given how closely chimpanzee foraging behavior tracks with likely early hominin behavior, it's a reasonable bet that our ancestors were doing something very similar, long before anyone was writing it down. Put all of this together and the picture gets more complicated than rain equals danger. The same storm that could kill through cold, flooding, or a shared cave with a predator was also quietly resetting the landscape, leaving behind clearer tracks, stored water, and easier food, all waiting on the other side of it. Survival here wasn't about the rain being good or bad. It was about which side of the storm you were looking at and whether you knew how to use what it left behind. If you're enjoying learning how much thinking went into simply getting through a rainstorm, subscribing helps this channel keep digging up stories like this one. And once the rain finally stopped, there was still one more thing left to understand about that day. Add to that everything else this one storm forced into existence. A fire kept alive through hours of downpour. Pigment ground and mixed with deliberate care. Cord twisted strand by strand into something strong enough to hold a tool together. A sleeping mat rebuilt to keep insects out. Paintings carried deep into total darkness for reasons no one fully understands. And around the flame, story after story, passed from the people who remembered to the people who needed to. None of it happened because anyone chose to be creative. It happened because the rain took away every other option and left behind nothing but time, materials, and each other. That's the part worth sitting with. Human ingenuity didn't arrive because life got easier. It arrived because life got harder, and staying still was the only choice left. So the next time rain taps against your window, and your only decision is which blanket to reach for, remember what that same sound once demanded of the people who came before you. Their answer to being trapped is the reason you're here to hear it at all.